Chapter 30 Execution. Tomas Larsson was a coward and a mentally stunted racist with a small and vicious disposition. He was not particularly fond of the Jews either, but for the time being, he reserved the lion's share of his animosity for folks of any colour besides pale white. Yet he was an excellent soldier all the same. Heretofore, he had never blanched at an order from a superior. Mob rule and peer pressure had always surmounted and overwhelmed his cowardice. Yet, as the firing squad marched in the twilight, although he had little compunction about shooting the young, skinny Jew with the Iron Cross, he was having a little difficulty wrapping his head around the act of killing the tall German captain. To Tomas, Wolfgang Strothmann looked every bit the ideal Teutonic warrior. Along with that, it was getting dark. A storm was rolling in toward them, and Tomas was getting fed up with his co-equal partner in the firing squad. Corporal Anton Schloss was, as so many of his Germanic tribesmen were, a perfectionist. They had already passed through at least 2 small, serviceable clearings that would have done the trick, but Anton was insistent on finding a truly excellent one. In the meantime, it was growing darker by the moment, and it was killing Tomas to bite his tongue and avoid the conflict. So he and Anton Schloss led their prisoners and the other 4 members of the firing squad onward into the woods, searching for an absolutely perfect and suitable clearing in which to do the deed. Lightning struck in the distance. Thunder vibrated past them, booming through the forest. Tomas shot a look at Anton, but he seemed unfazed. "Flashlights, lads," said Anton. Tomas and the other 3 soldiers each had their assault flashlights around their necks. They were circular contraptions with this pull chain on the bottom. Giving the cord a yank spun the internal dynamo and cast light for 6 or 7 seconds per pull. They were convenient for assault, though not as effective as the box lanterns the sappers used. They would have to do for now. Tomas and the others yanked their chains and let the light linger, then pulled them again, creating a sort of strobe effect as they made their way through the woods. Just when Tomas was ready to absolutely lose control of his temper, the strobing beams lit up a clearing. Not just any clearing, the perfect clearing. It would have done nicely for a lover's picnic in peacetime. Tonight, it would do more than nicely for an execution. Tomas turned toward Anton and pulled the chain. He saw by Anton's face that they were at last in accord. "Yes, this is the place. Let's find some trees and get on with it," said Anton. Tomas rolled his eyes. Of course, they could not just shoot them in the head and move along. Anton would require perfection. As they used their lights to search out acceptable trees to tie Wolfgang and Jonah to, Tomas wished with all his heart that the Jew would stop crying. He had the men tie field dressings over the prisoner's eyes so he would not have to see the tears when he shot them. Isaiah was ready to make a fucking run for it. This was some prime grade A bullshit. Every instinct told him to make like a fucking rabbit, but the gashes on his ankle had opened up and were giving him plenty of pause. He might get a good jump start, but it would not hold up. Renoir glanced over at him. He read his protégé's intentions well after 3 years of fighting beside him. Renoir spoke quietly. "Patience. We must find our moment." Isaiah had already chosen that course. He knew that it was the sole option that lent itself a shot at survival, but he did not like it. If the sliver of opportunity Renoir hoped for came and went without them seeing it, he knew they were all dead men. They heard him before they saw him. The point man had gone ahead to scout. and his hobnail boots slapped on the cobblestones as he came out of the dark to meet them. Siegfried Siggy Martz had been a master of the long-distance run at university. To be trapped in the trenches with only the occasional assault to test him physically was his own personal hell. Ironically, he hated marching, but given the opportunity to run at his own pace, he was in his element. Tonight, he was enjoying the opportunity to stretch his legs again in service to the army. When he got back to Paul Becker's troop and their prisoners, he'd run a fast, steady 2 miles round trip. He felt proud that his lungs and heart seemed to have held their conditioning quite well. Although he had broken a healthy sweat, he factored some of that to the ripe humidity in the air. He was hopeful that Becker would send him out again to scout. If the rain came, it would make for a delightful evening jaunt. He found Becker and saluted. "Captain." "Report." "Sir, there's a train platform ahead. The sappers blew the tracks, but half of the roof is intact. As good a shelter from the weather as we will find, I'm afraid." "How far?" "Dead ahead. Less than 2 kilometers." "Very good. Run on and pick a campsite." Ziggy smiled. "Yes, sir." Paul knew the boy loved to run. He understood that, as a leader, it was important to recognize the needs of one's subordinates. By keeping those needs in check, then doling them out on auspicious occasions, it developed a clear dynamic of leader and follower. Very helpful when push came to shove, and demands for absolute discipline had to be made. Ziggy's footfalls vanished into the evening. In the distance, silent lightning flashed, followed quickly by the thunderclap. Paul Becker was glad that at least half a roof awaited them. Isaiah glanced again at Renoir. Renoir spoke quietly, translating Ziggy's missive for the group. "A train platform, 2 kilometers ahead. They plan to shelter there for the night. That will be our opportunity. You ain't noticed it's already fucking night. We lucky motherfuckers if we make it another mile without no trouble." "Even so, a bullet in the back is an assured death as well," said Renoir. "Silence," said Becker, ending the conversation. Rupert, Hans Deal, and Tedrick Christensen escorted Caitlin and Dr. Halstead along the road to Ham. Rupert was looking for a place to shelter for the evening, but every domicile they'd passed so far had been put to the torch. Sleeping out in the open had more initial appeal than staying in a sooty hovel, but he tasted the rain in the air, and just like Becker, he was hoping that before it was completely dark, he would find a structure whose roof was intact, sooty or no. Thus far it looked exceedingly unlikely. As night came on, Caitlin and Halstead exchanged nervous glances. Walking on the open road in the dark felt like suicide. Rupert was waved to by Halstead. "Mate, you speak English?" Rupert glanced at the doctor. "Kein English." "Christ," Halstead muttered. Suddenly, Caitlin doubled over, clutching her stomach in pain. She muffled a cry and dropped to her knee. "Caitlin, you all right?" Halstead stopped. He touched her elbow, but she shrugged him off. Rupert was concerned. He did not want anyone dying on his watch, especially not a woman, and in particular a non-combatant nurse. He bent down in front of her and tried to assess her situation. "Fräulein, geht es dir gut?" Caitlin gritted her teeth. Her left hand came up and rested limply on Rupert's shoulder as she tried to overcome whatever was wrong. "We just need a moment, please." Rupert nodded. It seemed she would be all right after all. Perhaps just a woman's trouble. He relaxed. She moved, and it was a lightning strike. Her left hand grasped his collar, her right hand found the hilt of his bayonet and yanked it from his leather frog in one motion. Before Rupert could react, the point was under his chin. Hans and Tedric fumbled for their weapons, but Hans had confiscated Caitlin's shotgun, and his Mauser's strap was beneath it. He tried to unsling his rifle, but it was trapped under the shotgun's leather strap. Halstead might have been a doctor, but he was also Australian. His punch struck Tedric squarely in the nose and broke it cleanly. The Mauser clattered to the ground. Halstead scooped it up and pointed it towards Hans and Tedric. "Stop! No one has to get killed here, mate. No one has to die." Hans had nearly gotten free of the shotgun. Halstead levelled the Mauser in his direction. Hans stopped and raised his hands. "Nick schießen!" Caitlin kept the bayonet under Rupert's chin as she pulled the rifle off his shoulder. She stepped back and guided him to the earth with the rifle barrel. Rupert kept his hands high and sat cross-legged on the ground. Caitlin turned to Tedric and Hans. She motioned with the rifle. "On the ground. On the ground with him." Tedric, still wincing from his broken nose, sat down next to Rupert. Caitlin stopped Hans and divested him of the shotgun and the bag of shells he had taken from her. Then she made him join Rupert and Tedric on the ground. "Look," Caitlin said, "I don't speak German, but you got to understand, maybe you've seen it, but something's happening. The dead rising and brutalizing and killing, and I can't just march along with you and die. So I'm going to leave you your rifles, although they won't do you much good. You ought to just run for shelter, run for your fortifications, run for your fucking lives." Caitlin placed Rupert's Mauser and bayonet on the ground, about 10 feet from them. She did not think they had understood a word, but at least she had tried, and that was some balm for her conscience. She had no time for any bullshit above and beyond that. Night had come. In the distance, lightning split the sky. There was a moment's hesitation, and then the thunder vibrated through them. The storm was near. Caitlin grabbed Halstead's elbow, and together they ran off the road into the woods. It was difficult for Adolf to keep up with the pack as they ran through the night. But the men running on both sides of him took turns coming back and holding his hands, each doing their damnedest to keep him from tripping and falling. They were not entirely successful, but Adolf was appreciative of their efforts. He just did not quite understand why they had to keep up this ferocious pace. When he asked the man holding his arm, the answer that he got was completely unintelligible. Had Adolf been able to see, he would have understood that the reason behind that was threefold. One, the man's body was that of none other than British infantryman Kevin Bergen, who in life spoke no German. His mother tongue, English, was something he had never mastered beyond basic functional communication. Bilingualism would have been a near impossibility. Two, Kevin's lower jaw was shattered, a consequence of his murder in the Abbey's graveyard. And three, the spirit that fused with Kevin's body only spoke Ptolemaic Egyptian and a dash of Latin. When it spoke to Adolf through its broken jaw, it was a series of warm, wet, incomprehensible utterances stuck somewhere in the back of Kevin's throat. So Adolf soldiered on, taking painful spills, but there was always at least one set of helping hands to care for him and lead him forward. He heard disturbing noises in the distance, weeping and crying, shrieks of pain, pleading entreaties, but he shut that out and moved ahead, trusting the wisdom and love of his caretakers to keep him on the path and out of harm's way. The Red Maiden had been watching. When the ginger-haired girl seized the bayonet from the wee little man, the Red Maiden knew that she was the one she had been looking for. Although the ginger girl was not as tall as she would have liked, she had grit, and grit counted for a lot to the Red Maiden. When the ginger girl ran with her partner, leaving a trail of bewildered men in grey sitting on the road, The Red Maiden looked to her cadre and signalled, just as she would have to a Viking raiding party 10 centuries past. As they slipped out onto the road, the Red Maiden felt a burst of pleasure at the thought of running and killing in a woman's body again. Abandoning the German major with the bloody hair would be a joy-filled rebirth. Hans Deal saw her coming. He yelped in surprise. Tedric stood and stepped toward the men coming out of the woods. Despite their bloody appearance, in the light of his flashlight, they did not look that much worse than the sappers had when they clawed their way up and out of the collapsed mine. He did not realize that he was in danger until he was already dead. There was a glint of heavy silver steel and a thud on his skull. He succumbed to death before he ever had the chance to register pain. When the saber struck Tedric Christensen, Rupert's short stature served him as well as it ever would. Before the demons, and Rupert saw them for what they were, could slaughter Hans, Rupert stood and ran. A blade that would have beheaded a taller man whooshed in and pinged off his shrapnel helmet. Rupert did not stay to watch Hans die. He heard the scream as he entered the forest, and he ran, devils nipping at his heels. The Red Maiden watched the short one disappear. Rage flashed across her brain at the failure. "Go after him!" she yelled. Her men needed little urging. They sprinted into the woods after the runt. The Red Maiden turned toward where the ginger girl had broken north and ran after, hot on her scent. In the woods, Caitlin and Halstead heard Hans Deal shuffle off his mortal coil with a scream. "Where do we go?" Halstead whispered. "Anywhere but here. Run!" Caitlin replied, and they forged ahead. Halstead shot her a glance. There was anger and fear in it, but he followed her order. There was little else to be done. They pushed through the woods and came out into a wheat field that stretched out into the distance. It had either been overlooked or magnanimously spared by the German occupiers. Perhaps the man told to put it to the torch had laboured beside Noah Brindle in the fields of Esslingen, scything and threshing, and had held his hand in mercy. Either way, the wheat waved, welcoming in the evening breeze, stretching up its golden spikes toward the clouds, eager to imbibe the spring rain that it sensed coming. As Caitlin led Halstead into the field at a dead sprint, fat, warm raindrops began to fall. When they were 50 yards in, the Red Maiden entered the field behind them, quickly closing the gap. Covetousness for the joy and comfort of Caitlin's flesh spurred her pace. Behind the field dressing blindfold, Wolfgang Strothman closed his eyes. He was content with this ending. He had hoped for it in the machine gun nest before Noah Brindle's act of supreme sacrifice saved him from Isaiah Taylor's grenade. Surrender had given him a brief respite until the horror of Good Friday consumed it. But now that the certainty of death was before him again, he had no good reason to go any further. At least it would be brief. A bullet or two to the chest, a merciful pistol shot to the brain. All would go black, he hoped. Beside him, Jonah's tears flowed, soaking his blindfold. He saw the light of the flashlights, the gauzy filter of cotton. He heard the zip of the little chains that spun the dynamos being pulled, briefly firing up the little incandescent bulbs. He did not want those lights to go out. Ever. Zip. Ready. Zip. Aim. Zip. The lights all fired up one last time, and all Jonah heard was screams and gunfire. As a massive wave of motion and darkness seemed to roar past on either side of him. It lasted less than a slow count of 15. Mouths of fire, shrieks of terror and pain and pleasure, then silence and darkness descended. Jonah and Wolfgang may not have known the particulars of what had just occurred, but they knew one thing. They had just been traded a merciful ending for one far worse. When Paul Becker and his troops first arrived at the abandoned train depot, they could not find their scout Ziggy. It was quite strange. When Paul's battery-powered lantern found the pool of fresh blood on the train platform, he turned the light upward and discovered the source. Lost Ziggy was found. He dangled upside down, naked and bloodless, suspended from his ankles by a rope that stretched over the rafters. He looked dead, and his eyes opened, and he grinned, stretching out his hands, growling, feral, grasping with his fingers, trying to reach the men below him. Then he began to croon in English with gusto the Confederate war dirge, "When this cruel war is over. Dearest love, do you remember when last did we meet? How you told me that you loved me, kneeling at my feet. Oh, how proud you stood before me in your suit of grey, when you vowed to me in country to be true throughout the fray. Weeping, sad and lonely, hopes and fears how vain, when this cruel war is over, praying that we meet again." Ziggy sang. Becker was shocked. He knew that Ziggy must be badly injured. "Stay still, Private! We will get you down!" Becker yelled, trying to calm him. Ziggy's herky-jerky movement was beginning to swing him like a pendulum as he reached down, trying to get hold of the men below him. The rope Ziggy was strung up with had been tied off to the door handle of the ticketmaster's office. Becker pointed to Private Steiner. "Cut him down!" Steiner left the prisoners. He pulled his bayonet out, grabbed the thick hemp, and began sawing at it with the serrated blade. Becker was beginning to get angry about Ziggy's ridiculous swinging. The man must have gone into shock. "Private Mutz, stay still! Get a hold of yourself, man!" The tallest man among them, Private Brandt, set his rifle aside and reached up for his friend's hands as he swung past. "Ziggy, calm down, man! Give me your hands, or you'll land on your head!" Private Brandt did not like yelling at a wounded man, but he knew from past experience that sometimes that was the one way to get through battlefield shock and trauma. Becker could not conceive that Ziggy was no longer Ziggy. The hemp was fraying fast under Private Steiner's bayonet. "Grab hold of him," commanded Becker. It seemed to have worked. Ziggy grabbed Private Brandt's hands on the next pass, screaming with delight at the sensation of touching warm flesh. Brandt was shocked at how cold and strong Ziggy was. "I have him," Brandt said. In his brain, he had an odd thought. "And he sort of has me." Isaiah looked at Renoir. The moment had come. Renoir gave him the nod. "Now!" Isaiah ducked low and launched himself, wrapping up and driving the guard who had his Lewis gun backward until they fell off the platform together, into the darkness and onto the railroad tracks below. Corporal Hayden, who was watching the horrific spectacle of bloodless, naked Ziggy dangling, had proceeded past the initial shock to wonder who the hell had done this to Ziggy, when out of nowhere, Francois folded his thick arms around Hayden's neck and cinched them tight. Durant grabbed the man nearest him and shoved him across the platform into Steiner. Steiner stumbled to the platform. His bayonet flew from his hand and clattered away. The rope that cinched Ziggy's ankles was 3/4 of the way cut, but it held fast. Renoir had Brandt's rifle. He leveled it at Becker before his machine pistol was out of its holster. James was frozen. All of it had him in a state of terror. He knew the song that was belting out of the naked dead man intimately, and it made him shake. "Private," said Renoir, "get the captain's pistol, now!" James stumbled, almost slipping in Ziggy's bloody pool. He reached Becker and pulled the Mauser machine pistol out of its holster, then ducked back toward Renoir, his eyes on Ziggy, who he felt staring down at him. "Hey there, James. How are you, old pal?" asked Ziggy. Tears began to stream down James's cheeks. Isaiah Taylor limped back onto the platform a little worse for wear, but armed with his machine gun, which he aimed at the 4 remaining Germans. "Put your weapons down," yelled Renoir in German. He gestured toward Brandt, who still was held fast by dangling Ziggy. "Let go of him and step away." Brandt released Ziggy's hands, but Ziggy did not let go. I cannot," Brandt said. Ziggy grinned. He began pulling on Brandt, lifting him to his tiptoes until Brandt was forced to pull back with all his strength to keep from being pulled off the ground. "No!" shouted Durant. The rope snapped, and Ziggy collapsed on top of Brandt, snarling and biting. James turned and ran, disappearing into the night. Isaiah pulled the trigger, and a fusillade of bullets roared out of the Lewis gun toward Ziggy, but the demon had kicked his feet free of the rope. It dragged Brandt up, letting him take the bulk of the fire. Then he disappeared off the platform, leaving just a limp rope and dead Private Brandt, his blood now mingling with Ziggy's in a burgeoning pool beneath him. Adolf heard Thomas Larson, Anton Schloss, and the other members of the firing squad crying out in his native tongue, begging for their lives, and the cries of pain and terror as they were killed. Adolf was okay with all the killing, but it was odd to him that his companions were killing Germans. It did not seem right. Then suddenly, the hands that had been so kind to guide him in his blindness for so long were pushing him backward, but with none of the love and care he had so recently enjoyed in their companionship. His back and head hit a tree trunk hard, then his hands were wrenched behind him, and he felt leather cord biting into his wrists, binding him around the pith of a pine. "Hello!" he shouted. No one seemed to pay it any mind. Where had his friends gone? Where the hell were they? A mistake had been made. This could not be right. Jonah was tied to the tree next to the one that Adolf was bound to. He wept at his fate and thought on all the sins that had brought him to this juncture. Unlike Adolf, he knew that no mistake had been made. He knew that this ending was just and right. But it was bitter all the same. Then he heard laughter, and a song he recognized, in a language he did not understand. Three blind mice, see how they run, see how they run. They all ran after the farmer's wife, who cut off their tails with a carving knife. Did you ever see such a thing in your life as 3 blind mice? Wolfgang heard the song too. He recognized it from his childhood. He felt this thing singing the ditty drawing close to him. Then its hands were resting on his chest, and he tasted its hot breath on his face. It whispered to him, "Come and see." A jolt of electricity shot through Wolfgang, and Wolfgang saw, and he would never be the same. The Red Maiden caught Halstead and Caitlin just as they reached the center of the wheat field. She attacked with care. She did not want to shatter this vessel. She wanted it pristine and sanguine when she took hold of it. She tackled the ginger girl from behind and stunned her with a punch to the back of the head. She had her, clean and simple, to do with as she willed, but first the Red Maiden put her attention to killing the man who had accompanied her. The thing that had risen in the corpse of Harry Moss and gone a-hunting in the guise of a sentient poison gas had slipped and slithered through the 2 nights since it left the British Arms Depot. When it chanced upon the living, it choked them down with its vicious blend of phosgene and chlorine, then devoured their souls into its form. By the time it reached the train platform, The voices in its consciousness had gone from manifold murmurs to a dull roar of memories of human sadism and anguish. On the train platform, Renoir knew the smell the moment it reached his nose. It was the aroma of freshly cut grass on his estate in Ypres before the war. There was phosgene in the air. "Gas!" he yelled. Becker and his men smelled it too, and recognized it in the same instant. Paul reached for his gas mask, but Renoir gestured with the Mauser. "No, you wait!" Renoir and Durant kept their weapons pointed at the Germans as they fumbled with the catches on the gas mask pouches, pulling the box respirators free. "Go ahead, I got 'em covered. Just be quick," said Isaiah. He held the MG on the Germans, while his eyes searched the darkness for Ziggy. Francois released his hostage and pulled on his gas mask. As soon as he, Renoir, and Durant were in their respirators, Isaiah set down the MG and pulled on his own. Renoir pointed to Becker. "Go ahead." Becker and his men wasted no time pulling off their helmets and yanking their gas masks on. Renoir hollered to Becker in German as they did. "You see, we did not lie." Becker nodded, uncertainly. But it was already too late. All around the train trestle platform, the gas began to rise up, a thick, poisonous fog, hemming them in on all sides. Then it rolled over the edge of the concrete platform, stretching its willowy tentacles and tendrils over Brandt's corpse. It snaked into his nose and open mouth, and marionetted him up to a sitting position. Then, like the snake that its painted cylindrical containers had brought to Harry Moss's mind in the arms depot, it struck. The gas hit Becker and the Germans first, lashing out, shattering the lenses of their gas masks, pouring into their throats, gagging and choking them mercilessly, letting them taste what they had brought to bear on their British and French cousins, dragging them to their knees to drown on the cold concrete. "Run! Run!" shouted Renoir. Isaiah did not need any urging. He dropped the heavy Lewis gun and leapt from the platform, clearing the gas. He landed hard on his injured ankle, and it buckled, but he ignored the pain and ran. The gas rose up behind Isaiah, a wave of death, preventing Renoir, Francois, and Durant from following his path. They turned the opposite direction and jumped onto the train tracks. Renoir hit the ground first, Francois just behind him. But before Durant cleared the precipice, a thick arm of gas wrapped around his legs and tackled him. It spun him and threw him into the station house, stunning him. Then it overwhelmed him, pinning him to the earth. As Francois and Renoir disappeared, Durant was held immobile, firmly in the embrace of the gas, as if a dozen men were sitting on his chest, holding his arms and legs fast. He watched Becker and his fellows in their final twitches of agony. Then their bodies went still. The gas did not release its grip on Durant. A wisp of it made its way across the glass of his respirator's eye lenses. It applied pressure, and the glass cracked open. A wisp flowed into the mask and tickled Durant's eyelashes and cheeks. It played beneath his nose and delicately ran across his lips and chin. It filled the mask completely until he could not see. Then rough hands ripped the mask off his face. Dead Private Brandt stood over him. He chucked the broken mask aside and laughed. He walked over to the bloody rope that held Ziggy up and wound it in a coil between his left hand and elbow. Durant was still held frozen by the cloud of gas that had enveloped him, watching Brandt finish gathering up the rope. Then he saw naked, bloodless Ziggy climb back onto the platform. Both demons looked at Durant and grinned. Then they leapt off the platform into the night. Becker's body stood, followed by Steiner and the other dead Germans. They split off in all directions. Durant lay there for what seemed an eternity. Then rain began to fall. It began to pour. It struck the particles of gas and broke them up, rinsing the air clean. Durant watched as it dissipated and disappeared, and the pressure on his body eased. When he felt it had gone, he lay there for a moment, letting the rain wash over him. Lightning flashed close by. Thunder rattled the platform. Durant dragged himself to his feet. Then he forced one foot in front of the other, and he ran. As they limped along the train tracks in the downpour, he had no idea what happened to the others, but when Renoir told him to run, he had taken him at his word. The adrenaline had worn off, and the pain shooting through his bleeding and now twisted ankle was like having shards of glass shoved directly into the joint. He paused to catch his breath and marshal his will to go on, and they struck, tackling him straight to the trestles. His head bounced off metal tracks, knocking him out cold. When Isaiah came back to himself, he had been hog-tied. A rope noose hung loosely around his shoulders. 4 men were carrying him. Ziggy and Brandt had his arms. 2 others that he could not make out in the dark had his legs. Ziggy smiled down at him. Well, well, sure I'm glad you're back with us, old pal. You're just in time for the party. The 4 demons laughed. The rain continued on. Isaiah Taylor knew exactly who was speaking to him through Sigmund Ziggy Martz's dead mouth. He knew there was no way out of this but the grave. Halstead had seen Caitlin collapse in a heap. For the briefest moment he thought to stop, to help her, to sacrifice himself so he could get up and run. Then the moment was past and it was too late to reverse course. He realized he had not even slowed, much less stopped. Halstead reached the woods on the far side of the field. The Red Maiden came to a halt and watched as the coward vanished into the trees. There would be time for him later. Caitlin was on her knees. Her hands scrambled in the dirt amongst the stalks of wheat. She knew the Red Woman from her dreams was with her now, and that the axe would fall at any moment. Her hands closed on wood and steel, and she grabbed hold of it. She rolled onto her back, and the Red Woman was there, blood-stained man in German jodhpurs and high black leather cavalry boots. It grinned down at Caitlin and brushed the stiff hair back out of its face. It stepped toward her, hungry, eager, covetous, and Caitlin remembered Isaiah's tutelage. She slam-fired the shotgun at knee level. The 7 buckshot rounds threshed wheat and leather boots and the legs that girded. They threshed jodhpurs and arms and face as the Red Maiden's vehicle fell forward and was blown to pieces. Then the shotgun was empty, and there was nothing but silence in the field as the Red Maiden's being began to rise out of the brutalized mouth and nose of the corpse. Caitlin rose and ran and ran and ran and ran as far and as fast as she could. She ran for hours until she finally fell from sheer exhaustion. Caitlin woke with the next day's dawn to find that she was alone and she was alive. She was not certain that was a good thing anymore.